We are underway with our journey through the Venetian Republic, and after all this time of promising it, it's almost weird to actually be doing this. We got about halfway along Crete last time, and we're just on the outskirts of the largest Venetian centre on the island, and the site of the most dramatic chapter of the story of Venetian Crete. This is Heraklion, known in Venetian times as Candia. We're not going to use that name a whole lot, as not only did the Venetians refer to the whole island as Candia, but it's just a couple of consonants switched around to make Harnia, and that's a needless confusion we can do without. But just before we arrive there, there's somewhere we've got to see on the road to the city. As the coast curves around and the Gulf of Heraklion comes into view, it's one of the smaller forts we did briefly get to see, Palaeocastro. Now, brief note here, you'll come across a lot of Palaeocastros around Greece. There's a Minoan palatial complex also on Crete that goes by the same name, despite being separated by about 3,000 to 4,000 years in age. That's mainly because Palaeocastro just means old castle, or early castle, if you like. This site actually began life as a Genoese fortification for the brief period they had seized control of Crete in the 1200s, but during the upgrades to the island's fortifications between 1573 and 1595, this was shored up and took on its triangular shape. It's not a huge structure, but it has a cracking location on this rock that juts out above the coastline with views across the bay and over to Heraklion. Now, we only just barely had time to stop and look at it, and didn't have enough time during the drive to really get to explore, but glad we at least got a glimpse. So, moving along, we arrive at Heraklion, and like Harnia, the quality of Venetian stuff to see here is phenomenal. And man, if it wasn't that flights to Crete quickly climb out of reach price-wise, I mean, I've had to summon just every ounce of restraint making these episodes not to just book flights right back there again. I got some modest footage for this one. I mean, to be honest, where elsewhere Venetian forts frequently stand alone, framed by just the cliffs and the sky, Heraklion's walls are somewhat buried in the fabric of the city. I mean, you really wouldn't believe how easily you can conceal walls that get so high, but well, just wait and see. Beginning at the waterfront, one of the most instantly recognisable parts of the Venetian town, the fort. On the way there, you can see parts of the seawall. I haven't been able to pull up much information on how much of this has been remodelled. I mean, unquestionably, some of this is far too neat to be original. But I can't tell if it's just a restoration or if it's actually been entirely rebuilt. While there was a port here as far back as the Minoans, the fort you're seeing is the result of the works in 1523 to 1540, replacing the former Byzantine defences. You can see, albeit a rough depiction of the city and harbour in this 1417 map, thanks to the medieval cartographer Cristoforo Buondelmonte. The fort can be roughly divided into two segments, a rectangular segment on the southwest side and a semicircular segment to the northeast. The outer walls are 9 metres thick in places, which, I mean, credit where it's due, that is immense. The inside also gives you a good idea as to the layout and feeling of an artillery fortress. I mean, a lot of which is primarily concerned with the movement of cannons and munitions, but there's also rooms that served all the function of a garrison living there, including the barracks, storage rooms, and a reservoir for water. It has these serene, high-vaulted ceilings, and the cool and silence of its interior feels like stepping into a sort of church. Particularly in the heat of the Cretan summer, it's a treat. You emerge blinking back into the sunlight on the roof with its substantial battlements. The battlements are actually one of the few modifications that the Ottomans made once they'd taken the city. It made this a better platform to deliver musket fire. In total, by 1630, it was equipped with 18 cannons on the ground floor and a further 25 that could be deployed to the roof. From the fort, you can also see some of the vestiges of the Venetian harbour. A lot of this has been lost to modern development. In Harnia, with its elegant historical layout preserved, this most certainly is not. But most eye-catching are the bones of these huge former warehouses. Like Harnia, this is the Arsenale, the place where the Venetians built and repaired ships. There used to be many more of these, but a lot got bulldozed to make space for the road and other buildings. Just before we head around the edge for the tour of the walls, if we briefly head into the centre of Heraklion, there are three main places I'd like to draw to your attention. The first is the Loggia, an immaculately elegant town hall structure in the centre of the city. This final version was completed between 1626 and 28 under the auspices of the Doge Francesco Morosini. While it's had to have been restored, the courtyard reached through the portico out front is particularly grand. The symmetry is rather satisfying. The loggia is in St Titus Square, which takes its name from this church. It has quite an ancient foundation, but has been altered a great many times. In fact, since what you're seeing retains comparatively little of its Venetian past, with quite a distinctive Ottoman makeover. We already did quite a lengthy episode with an overview of the Ottoman architecture that survives in the modern Greek state, including quite a bit on Crete, so maybe check that out. Lastly, the Morosini Fountain, well, can't really ignore that. Would have saved it for Lion Watch, but it's a little bit too significant not to flag now. It's probably the busiest part of town, and it's not just for show, but the endpoint of a major hydraulic engineering project bringing water down from Mount Juctus, 15 kilometres away. It was completed in 1628. Okay, the fortifications. We are actually blessed with a wealth of sources on what historical Candia would have looked like. I keep forgetting this. I'm much more used to ancient sites where we are fortunate if there's even written descriptions surviving from antiquity, but we're in the early modern period and there's actual art, people sketching and painting the fortifications in their original form. It's so refreshing. So, going clockwise, as you walk through the warehouses at the waterfront, the walls emerge from amongst the various hotels and waterfront developments. You may quickly tire of me complaining about this, but damn it, Janet, can you stop using your Venetian fortifications as car parks? You may not believe me on this, but making these episodes is not as straightforward as point the camera at the thing, move on. I mean, other than #Don'tFightTheLight, I'll often get home from a trip, look back at the footage and ask, why haven't I got more coverage of a site, or why is it framed so tight and weird? And it's because the composition was bad or difficult. Cars, roads, power lines, ugly buildings, ugly people. These are the elements I am trying to eliminate from shots wherever possible, but unsurprisingly this is not always possible, and the Venetian walls of Heraklion are doing me no favours in that regard. Look, I can make no grand claims that we're making something exquisite from a cinematography perspective, but I can't and won't just have an episode entirely full of ugly compositions any more than filming in a puppy abattoir or drinking Nescafe. And yes, those two are equally abhorrent. Well, you've got the Sampionara Bastion here, suffering from a bit of graffiti, but you can at least get close to the walls in this section and appreciate their height and form without interruption. Well, right up until the other natural enemy of Venetian bastion fortifications, tennis courts. Yeah, no worries guys, it's not like it's, flicking a big architectural middle finger at one of the island's most historically significant monuments. You see, this is what happens when you have to share your island with one of the most enigmatic and alluring Bronze Age cultures. All the boys at the bar making eyes at the Minoans, and everyone's ignoring one of the most significant set of artillery fortifications still surviving in the Eastern Mediterranean. This northeastern side is one of the best to appreciate the scale of the walls. It's hard to get an exact statistic on their height as it varies from section to section, but it gets as high as 20 metres in places, and this side is using the natural rise of the terrain to its advantage, making them even more formidable. There's a road that can take you up to the centre here, and you pass this rather beautiful former Ottoman fountain. Now, it's at this point that your path becomes a lot less obvious. I actually got a bit turned around deciding how best to follow the walls at this point. The trees also begin masking the walls to a problematic extent, in addition to also being used as a car park. As I said, you can point the camera at it, but you can't really get usable footage out of it. I did try. So afraid there's not much to show you until you get close to the Kenyoria Gate, or Kamara Gate, which has been widened to allow cars through. It's a lot prettier from the inner side, and I took this opportunity to grab a coffee island there, and since the trees were continuing to obstruct the views, I took this opportunity to climb atop the walls. This is the Jesus Bastion, just like all the bastions that Jesus talked about so much. Yeah, read the New Testament. This is a nice change to see the rooftops of the modern city, but the top of the walls is practically spacious enough to be a raised public park. I mean, that said, maybe don't leave your kids unsupervised. There's also a theatre tucked into the armpit of the Jesus Bastion. That's a weird sentence. Further along, and sorry I don't have a better wide shot of this, blame the trees, the highest point of the walls is sort of an additional fortress on top of the already gigantic fortifications. It's the Martinego Bastion. You can't get the scale from these shots, but you are looking down on top of the bastion, which itself is already huge. Not that they could resist also plopping a football pitch on top. Between that and the Bethlehem Bastion is the Bethlehem Gate, again, widened for traffic. And we've almost completed the loop now. This is the Pantocrator Bastion, quite a bit more visible here. The Pantocrator Gate, just inside, looks to have been restored somewhat in more recent times. I've not actually seen this type of patterning on other Venetian structures, but it's all very pretty. And then with some basketball courts, we finally arrive at the water again with the St. Andrew's Bastion. If you want to walk this loop yourself, make sure to set about at least 90 minutes if you're going to power walk it, or more like 3 hours if you're going to take your time. It's a lot. And believe it or not, after all that, these walls are not even the full extent of the Venetian defences of the town. If you look at earlier sketches of the town, you can see that the walls had additional layers of outworks. However, these were demolished in the rebuilding following World War II, where Heraklion had been heavily bombed, and so there's nothing to see of these now under the modern city that extends outwards. Now, the story of the 21-year siege of Candia is a dramatic one, and one that deserves time to flesh out, especially in the context of the geopolitics that lead there. It's going to weigh this episode down a bit too heavily, and, if we scatter the story of the Republic in amongst the episodes, we'll have to tell it all out of order. It's going to be much harder to follow. So, while we'll pick the threads up as we go, we are working towards a monster episode in a longer format where we can really take some time with the details and make it worth your while. Something we need to attend to while we're here, and something else we can't devote a ton of time to just yet, but we keep describing the Venetians and Venetian Crete. Now, suffice to say, when we talk about the Venetian periods in these places, it's the status quo of the Venetians being a ruling elite with a local population, often speaking a different language, practicing church very differently, things like that. So we look at the beautiful architecture that's left and it all seems just lovely, but often these two groups did not mesh at all well. On Crete specifically, Venetian rule did not go over smoothly. The island was first purchased by the Republic shortly after the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople. The locals made numerous attempts at gaining independence, with insurgencies and skirmishes being commonplace for almost 150 years. So I'm quite sure I'll have to say this again over and over as the episodes go on and the nationalists start sounding off in the comments, but we are describing the Venetian eras in these territories. It is not a population replacement. The Venetians would have a profound effect on just about everything from architecture, social structure, yes, all of that. But this was a comparatively small number of people alongside a local population that was somewhat ethnically and socially distinct. For example, we'll be spending a considerable time in this series in the modern state of Croatia, and the relationship between Croat culture with the Italian, Venetian, and subsequently Dalmatian culture is complex. Both would inform each other. The parts of modern Croatia that Venice did not control are quite different architecturally, culturally, all across the board. So, yes, please bear that in mind through the series. We are talking about Venetian rule over a native population. We are not crediting the Venetian rulers themselves with doing all the work. The walls of Heraklion were not built by a workforce of Italian aristocrats or merchants. They, of course, required vast quantities of local labour. And by way of example, a quick one I nearly forgot about. To the south of Heraklion, on a large fertile area known as the Messara Plain, there are several ancient Minoan cities overlooking the arable land below, including Ayatriada to the west and Phaistos. Now, while these ruins are pushing 3,500 plus years old, at the entrance to Phaistos is a very different structure entirely. This is the church of Aios Georgios Philandras, built in the 1500s when the Venetian rule was well established on Crete. Now, we're not including as much ecclesiastical architecture on this series, and this is partly because of the distinction between Venetian church practice and local tradition. In very simple terms, one of the greatest obstacles to Venetian rule being firmly established was, yes, a degree of religious tension. I am not going to relitigate the 1054 schism between what would become Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, but yes, no great shock. The Venetians' staunch Catholic background and the Greek population's Byzantine Orthodox tradition, both sides viewed the other with disdain, and this would be a pattern you'd see all through the Greek territories Venice would control at one time or another. Perhaps more than anything, it entrenched the gulf of them and us between the two groups. And sure, a gigantic Ottoman invasion, for example, would represent a common threat, but religious worship, perhaps more than wealth or language, would mark the two communities as distinct. So put it this way, Because of their architecture and their familiar hallmarks with similar found around the Mediterranean, I feel pretty comfortable describing these as Venetian walls or Venetian forts. But despite being built in the 1500s, it's post-Constantinople. The revolts that marked the first couple of centuries of Venetian Crete have mostly subsided, but does that make this a Venetian church? Well, in this case, for example, this was an Orthodox male monastery, and while we're not certain, this may have been the site where a monastery was founded by St. John the Stranger in the 900s. There were churches and monasteries on Crete that were founded in the Catholic tradition during Venetian rule. For example, what is now better known as the Marazza Mosque began life as a church built by an Augustinian order. We didn't mention this last time, but this church in Hernia began as a Dominican cathedral in 1320. Anyway, while we will get to some churches and even cathedrals later that are distinctively Venetian, this is why we're not covering every building that was constructed at the time, even if it was during the era of Venetian rule. Getting on the road and heading further east. After Heraklion fell, it signalled the end of Venetian control on Crete, as Hernia and Rethymno had already fallen at the beginning of the Ottoman assault. However, in the terms of surrender, the Venetians still retained 3 fortified islands around Crete, which could be used as harbours for Venetian shipping. This might seem incongruous, but unlike other islands in the Cyclades to the north, Crete is enormous. On most of the other islands, if you took the main port, control of the island was essentially yours, but keeping charge of every inch of rugged Crete at all times is far from straightforward, and this is another reason why through much of the Middle Ages it was a bit of a pirate haven. We mentioned 2 of these last time, Gramvosa on the northwestern tip and Suda just south of Hernia, but the third and perhaps most impressive is a fair distance to the east. As the Cretan coast abruptly plunges south, the combination of the island, or well, it's practically an island, of Calydon and the curve of the bay makes for a very nice sheltered harbour. There is a great deal that can be said about Spinalonga, being a favourite spot for tours on Crete. We learned this from our first visit in 2017 when our tour guide talked our ears off about lepers for 3/4 of the time we had. Trust me, you are better off seeing the place away from a tour group, though goodness knows there's plenty of those. While there are some modern-ish buildings here, being an island, it's kept its original architecture and structure quite well. Construction on Spinalonga largely came after the widespread defensive works the Venetians undertook in the 1500s, beginning here in about 1579. As you approach it from the southern side, where all the visitor boats dock, you can see 2 large triangular bastions. Because of the close proximity and height of Calydon, you need fortifications up higher to prevent an enemy raining firepower down on you from the hill opposite, hence the large curved fortress in the high centre of the island. There's an encircling seawall around the island, and yes, to make the most of this, let's have a supercut. Most of the more modern buildings are on the western side facing the mainland, and as you get higher and further into the island, the more ruinous Venetian structures are still visible. To us, the long grass hides a lot. This slope is a maze of half-collapsed walls of buildings that once stood here. Well, that's Spinalonga, a quite singular island fortress, not just in Crete but in the Mediterranean as a whole. There is nowhere quite like it. Just before we leave Crete behind, there's one more Venetian fort far to the east. The town of Sitia is fairly far removed from the well-trodden tourist circuit of Crete, being out at the eastern extremity of the island, but it still houses part of what was the Venetian fort here. It was closed when we went, so we couldn't see the inside. When the Ottomans assaulted the island, the Venetian general Mocenigo determined that Sitia simply wouldn't be able to withstand a major assault. Based on both Hernia and Rethymno holding out less than 2 months each, I feel like he was on the money with that assessment. So the Venetians demolished the fortress so they could move men and resources to Heraklion. Now, later on, the Ottomans did patch it up and make it back into a fortress, and it's been restored in modern times, though what you're seeing is just one part of the fortress that used to be here. As a little final bonus, just down the road, outside the Minoan archaeological site of Petras, there's this small tower. I can't tell you much about it other than it's Venetian in design, but it's too adorable not to include. So that's basically all we've got. It is a curiosity of Crete that the huge fortified towns of the Venetian era are all on the north coast. There are a few much smaller little Venetian fortlets on the south coast, and I already told you that my completionist itch is going to have me breaking out in hives not having my own footage of these to show you, but please believe me when I say they are nowhere near as large or noteworthy as the Venetian structures on the north coast. At their largest, they're just these rectangular forts only as long as, I don't know, however many cars that is. And many of them were altered by the Ottomans to the degree that they barely count as Venetian anymore, so please give us a break. I haven't included the southern fortifications in this video, we just did not get time to go down there. However, before we go, explained this one last week, Lion Watch! The mood is tense. Every week we showcase the Venetians' mixed attempts to portray their patron animal, the winged lion of St. Mark. And for a people famed for their elegant architecture, elegant art, and just elegant everything, their attempts at sculpting their own logo are invariably hilarious. The fortress at Heraklion has two, suffering pretty badly from either erosion or quite possibly deliberate damage in earlier centuries, particularly the one on the approach. Discernible, but mostly deteriorated. The one on the eastern side is actually not a bad attempt compared with some of the other work you'll be seeing. It's a beast too, got to be about 2 meters tall for the whole assemblage. But yes, compare this anatomy with, say, the lion-themed Morosini fountain at the centre of the city. Now, the hind legs and paws are structurally pretty much there, okay, but the upper half, apart from the fact they appear to have had a day at the stylist with the hair rollers in, the faces, ignoring the look of utter despair, they look more like some sort of deep-sea fish with this sort of human nose. And it's something I've never understood about fountains. Why do you want water pouring out of something's mouth? Like, when is that ever a good thing, when copious amounts of fluids are coming out of something's mouth? Woo! Yeah! Lion vomit! Alright!
And I had to re-record an extra segment, as there's a couple I missed on the first voiceover pass we did. This one is a bit weathered and missing a face, but is high up on the inside of the Pantocrator gate. Interestingly, they've made an attempt to restore the tail and the hind legs, but not the face. Then if you get to the Heraklion loggia, sorry for the digi-zoom, there's a bunch of tiny lions lining the outer frieze. There's something a little anatomically strange in the way they're holding that scroll, but then again, there's something a bit anatomically strange about a lion having an interest in the written word, or I don't know, having wings. Just wait till we get to the lions holding swords. You know you're in trouble when there's a winged lion coming towards you with a sword. Quick last one from Spinalonga, and easy to miss. It's up pretty high near the entrance gate, and not especially large, getting a strong I have no idea what I'm doing vibes on this one. It's kind of like someone asked him to hold a book open on a particular page, then disappeared, and it's been 10 minutes, but he feels too bad to put it down.
Anyway, we'll explain the next steps in the following episode, so see you back here for that. And please pass these around. It's so much harder to get people enthused about the early modern period and all things Venetian. Meanwhile, the music you've been hearing in the background is ours. We make all the music for these episodes, and you can find it all at bandcamp.com. If you want to support us, that is the place to do it. Otherwise, you know how to make our day. Drop a subscribe and a comment, follow us on the social medias, all of those things, and we'll be back very soon.